Coming up on the GCN Racing News Show today, what could have been the perfect day for Alaphilippe turned into a disaster at Liege-Bastogne-Liege. The world champion embarrassed by celebrating too early and relegated for sprinting too swervy. I know that makes no sense, but it rhymes. I'll be looking at what went wrong for him and what went right for Lizzie Deignan in the women's race. We've also got the opening two stages of the Giro D'Italia from Sicily, including that controversial opening time trial, and the BinckBank Tour, and La Flèche Wallonne, and the EF kit, and cyclocross, and the NFL legend saving the day for NTT possibly. We'd better get started. And starting with Liège-Bastogne-Liege. The race that normally ends the Spring Classics this year took place in the autumn, but not for the first time. It's twice previously been held in September. As expected, all the action came in the closing stages of the 257-kilometre race, and in particular on the final climb, La Roche-au-Faucon. That was where Julian Alaphilippe decided to make his move, but he wasn't able to shake Marc Hirschi of Team Sunweb, who made his way across to the Frenchman. Those two were later joined by the Slovenian pairing of Primož Roglič and Tadej Pogačar, and temporarily by Michał Kwiatkowski of Ineos Grenadiers. That gave us 5 Tour de France stage winners duking it out inside the last 10 kilometres of the race. An acceleration by Hirschi ended the hopes of the pole, leaving us with 4, and one of the most entertaining finishes to the race that we have seen in years. As they started to look at each other in the closing stages, it allowed Mathieu of Bahrain McLaren to close the gap, yet another Slovenian, and he did the only thing he could do to try and win, attacking them immediately, but really only served to provide a nice lead out for Alaphilippe. Here is how Carlton Kirby called the finale.
Alaphilippe comes out of his wake and goes for it right now and almost slams the door shut on the Bahrain rider, and it's Hirschi. Oh, and he gets nudged, Hirschi. Oh, and he's got his chain disregarded here, and Alaphilippe, is he going to take it? Oh, I think he may have just lost it on the line. Too busy celebrating, and I think Roglič has stolen this.
It looked like Alaphilippe's race to lose, didn't it? He hit out with just under 200 metres remaining, but after looking around to see that Hirschi was every bit his match, he swerved sharply to the left. That impeded Hirschi, who had to unclip from his pedal, and Pogačar, allowing Alaphilippe to sail to the victory and raise his arms in celebration. Only he hadn't won. Alaphilippe had made the most embarrassing mistake in cycling, celebrating a victory that actually belonged to somebody else. That person being Primož Roglič of Jumbo-Visma. Put your hands up if you were very, 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 very pleased to see Roglič take that victory. I've got absolutely nothing against Alaphilippe, I think he's fantastic, but Roglič so deserved that big win after the bitter disappointment of the Tour de France. He can now go into the off-season thinking very positively rather than negatively, and before that he can head to the Vuelta a España in a great frame of mind as well. And he won that race at his first time of trying. He's the first debutant, in fact, to win Liège-Bastogne-Liège since Yevgeny Berzin back in 1994. To add insult to injury, Alaphilippe was later relegated from 2nd down to 5th, last place from that front group, after it was deemed that his swerve was against the rules. After the race, he did apologise sincerely for the move, which he said wasn't deliberate, and I, for one, am not going to hate on Alaphilippe. I believe him when he said it wasn't deliberate, and I'm sure it's not something we'll see from him again. He's going to do that rainbow jersey proud. Now, the man who perhaps has most reason to be upset, though, is Marc Hirschi. He had more than a decent chance of becoming the youngest winner of a monument since Jean-Pierre Montserrat at the Giro de Lombardia all the way back in 1969. He was certainly looking good, wasn't he? Or even Pogačar. We saw him beat Roglič, of course, at a sprint at the Tour de France, but they and we will never know what might have been. What we do know is that 3 Slovenians finished inside the top 4 on the day. We have ourselves a new cycling superpower. Anyway, behind that front group, it was Mathieu van der Poel who won the sprint for 6th place. That, despite the fact that he'd appeared to have driven the chase virtually on his own for much of that final 10 kilometres, and the fact that he'd only finished the BinckBank Tour just the day before. We'll have more on that a little bit later on in the show. Now, before we finish with the men's race, a quick tip of the hat to Ben Tullet. He's a teammate of Van der Poel's at Alpecin Fenix, and he became the youngest finisher of the race since Victor Fastre back in 1909, 111 years ago. Tullet turned 19 just over a month ago and finished a very credible 53rd on the day, so very well done to you. Now, if you thought Alaphilippe had a bad day, spare a thought for those that came off even worse. Greg van Avermaet of CCC left the race after a crash. He's got multiple fractures and torn ligaments, which likely means he'll miss the rest of the season. That of course includes the races he loves most, they being the cobbled classics. Jay McCarthy of Bora Hansgrohe had been involved in the same crash into a central reservation, although I haven't been able to find any news on him. Michael Felgren of NTT also looked in a bad way after a separate crash, but he thankfully doesn't have any injuries serious enough to take him out of the cobbled classics. And finally, Damiana Caruso of Bahrain McLaren apparently got away with just a swollen wrist. Earlier on in the day, the women's race had taken place and there was live coverage of it for the very first time. And we were very pleased to be able to bring you that on our race pass. They may only have produced the final 30-something kilometres, but it's certainly an improvement, one step at a time. Once live coverage did eventually start, there was a strong breakaway already away that contained the likes of Marianne Vos of CCC and Lizzie Deignan of Trek Segafredo. The latter was clear by herself soon after that, riding away from everyone else at the top of the Côte de la Redoute. And she then carved out a very healthy lead of almost a minute over those behind her, but in the end, the margins probably weren't quite as comfortable as she would have liked. And that was because Grace Brown of Mitchelton Scott put in what was arguably the race of her life, gradually clawing Deignan back. However, the road ran out a bit too soon for Brown, and so it was Deignan who became the first non-Dutch woman ever to win that particular race. That marks her third big win of the season so far and puts her back in the lead of the UCI Women's World Tour standings, which were held, until that day, by Anna van der Breggen. Now, whilst the men's world champion was all over our screens on the day, it was a relatively anonymous day for the rainbow jersey in the women's race. Van der Breggen having to settle eventually for 26th place on the day, although that was 2 places ahead of former world champion Annemiek van Vleuten of Mitchelton Scott. And I honestly can't remember the last time that neither of those riders finished in the top 10 of a major race. And as our new GCN Racing Twitter account said after the race, it goes to show they are human after all. By the way, if you haven't given us a follow on that account and you'd like to, you can find us at GCN Racing. Massive congratulations though to Lizzie Deignan. I've said it before, but I'm going to say it again now. She is a huge inspiration to people the world over. Having a career break, to have a family, and coming back as good, or perhaps even better than ever. Here's the interview that she gave after the race.
How tense was it in the final part, knowing that Grace Brown was coming from behind?
Horrible, really, really horrible. I mean, in the end I decided to try and chase the motorbikes in front of me rather than think about her behind me, because mentally it's just cracking you when you think like that. So I knew that she would descend faster than me. I knew she had that advantage, so I was just praying the line would come quicker.
You are back in the lead of the UCI Women's World Tour. It's not over yet, but that's good news, of course.
Yeah, it's a reflection of the teamwork that we have. I think Elisa is also pretty close, so we can have some fun in the next races and think about that jersey. Great
stuff. We'll move on now to the Giro D'Italia, which kicked off with a 15.1 kilometre individual time trial into Palermo in Sicily. The route was quite unique in that it was mainly downhill, which sounds ideal, doesn't it? But perhaps not when a stage win and the leader's jersey is up for grabs at one of the biggest races in the world. Effectively, you're just asking riders to take big risks. Add in high winds and skittery time trial bikes, and I think we were all holding our breath for much of the race. Thankfully, the day was run off without any particularly bad crashes on the descent itself, but one man who did hit the deck was Victor Campenaerts, the world hour record holder of NTT Pro Cycling. He slid out round a hairpin right-hander and spoke to Bernie Eisel after the finish line and was quite critical about the nature of the route, but also the roads, which he said were extremely bumpy on the run into town. Here's that interview now.
To be really honest, when I was on the long stretch, the super fast, what is it, like 7 kilometer part going to the left corner, I was so happy that I crashed before, because this section was so dangerous. It was almost an off-road ride, going there 80k an hour, full of bumps, side wind. If you see the hour record holder going on a straight part out of the time trial position, I think the time trial was maybe a little bit too bumpy.
Not a happy man. It was those very bumps, in fact, which spelt the end of the race for Miguel Angel Lopez of Astana. He hit a pothole just as he was transitioning from the time trial bars to his base bars, losing control of his bike and careering into the barriers at the side of the road. Thankfully, he suffered no fractures and was able to leave the hospital on foot later that day. On to the actual results of that stage though, and there was no real surprise in the stage winner. Newly crowned world time trial champion Filippo Ganna stormed to victory with an average speed of 58.831 kilometers per hour. That actually gives him the record average speed for a Grand Tour time trial, but that is really quite a technicality because Rick Verbrugge clocked 58.874 kilometers per hour in the prologue of this very race 19 years ago. The Pinarello Bolide time trial bike, upon which Ganna rode, looked pretty special as well. Very fancy paint job, a custom 60-tooth, yes you heard that right, 60-tooth front chainring, grip tape on his bars and what looks like weightlifter's chalk, just to make sure his hands weren't going to slip off those bars. What do you reckon? Hot or not for that bike? Head over to our poll on the GCN app and let us know what you think. Least expected ride of the day, I have to say, was from the man who finished one place behind Ganna and at 22 seconds behind him, João Almeida of De Koning Quickstep. The 22-year-old was due to race here at the service of his teammate Remco Evenepoel, but in his absence, it'll be intriguing to see what he can get out of the race himself. Third went to multiple under-23 world time trial champion Mikkel Bjerg, and then the best of the main GC contenders was Geraint Thomas in fourth, 1 second further back. The Ineos Grenadier rider put some serious daylight, in fact, between himself and some of his key rivals for the GC. And in fact, here's a little table we drew up of the GC contenders after that first day. Over a minute back to Nibali, Kruijswijk and Fuglsang, although it does appear they were all hampered by a change in wind speed for the later starters. Simon Yates of Mitchelton Scott could also be very happy with his ride though, conceding less than 30 seconds to his fellow Brit. Things went from bad to worse actually for Astana the following day on stage 2. Alexander Vlasov, suffering from a stomach upset, became the second rider from that team to abandon the race in just 2 days. Not only was he set to be a key helper to Fuglsang, who is already down to 5 teammates now, but he had an outside shot of the podium himself, in my opinion. That second stage was won in a rather impressive fashion by Diego Ulissi, who now has 7 Giro stage wins to his name. Peter Sagan had to settle for another second place, whilst Mikel Honoré, yet another talented De Koning Quickstep youngster, was in third. Today we have got our first mountaintop finish of the Giro up to Mount Etna, so make sure that you don't miss that one. And don't forget we have live and interactive coverage of every single stage of the Giro over on Race Pass in the GCN app. Geo restrictions do of course apply. Plus, if you do have access to live coverage, you will also get extended highlights and post-race analysis in the breakaway show. You'll see Bradley Wiggins, Brian Smith and Orla Shenry joining me on that one. Plus Sean Kelly will be arriving for the Tour of Flanders in a couple of weeks and will remain throughout the Vuelta a España. For all other territories, you can enjoy shorter highlights from each stage. Now, before we finish with the Giro D'Italia, what has been grabbing most of the headlines over the last few days is some new kit. EF Pro Cycling pulled off one of the biggest marketing coups of recent times in the sport. The team, plus kit sponsor Rafa, teamed up with skateboarding and fashion brand Palace to create one of the most talked about kits the sport has ever seen. What do you reckon to that? From the reaction that I've seen so far, it appears that young people love it and old people hate it, so I of course love it. Now I know many people had never heard of Palace before, and the only reason I have is because of my 18-year-old son Ralph. Palace, Supreme, Bape, you name it, he's either got it or he wants it. I even got a Palace t-shirt of my 40th birthday recently. So I can tell you that my 18-year-old and some of his mates think that this new EF jersey is cool as anything. And anything that makes cycling cool amongst the younger generation is absolutely fine by me. So kudos to everyone involved in making that happen, and kudos to the UCI for handing out 500 Swiss franc fines for each of their riders, giving them even more publicity and headlines. It's been a good week for that team, I think that's very safe to say. It's also been a rather good week for Mathieu van der Poel of Alpecin Phoenix. At the BinckBank Tour, he was back to his very, very best. So going into the final day of the race, he was in 5th place on the general classification. He went with a move with 70 kilometres to go and then soloed away with about 50 kilometres still remaining. And despite the efforts of some of the best classics riders in the world behind him, he managed to not only stay clear and win the stage, but do enough to win the race overall too. And ominously, he says that he now has the legs he expects to have, so watch out everybody else at the upcoming cobbled classics. And to then pull off the ride he did just 24 hours later at Liege-Bastogne-Liege really was something else. Van Aert versus Van der Poel at the upcoming one-day races? Well, that's a mouth-watering prospect to say the very least, isn't it? It's going to be a while though before we see them both competing in cyclocross again, but the season continued last Saturday with the second round of the Ethias Cross, which was called the Polder Cross. It took place at a clay quarry, which created some unique riding conditions for the rides on a track that no one had ever seen before the day of the race. The women's race was a proper throwdown. Jeremy Power's words, not mine. The type we've come to love from women's cyclocross over the past few years. Leading out in the opening laps was Anna Kay, riding for Star Casino CX, but she was closely watched by the European champion Yara Castellijn. She hit out early and led the race all the way into the last lap, but then she made one mistake on a technical off-camber section, which allowed a chasing Lucinda Brandt of Liège-Bastogne-Liege, who was slowly but surely chipping away at Castellijn's lead in the last half of the race. Brandt closed the gap down to 6 seconds heading into that final lap, and when Castellijn had a slip on an off-camber muddy section, Brandt made contact, and as any professional would, she then delivered a lethal blow to Castellijn's psychological state, connecting and going straight past the European champion. Castellijn was then hanging on for dear life as Brandt went past, and Brandt came away with her first win of the season so far. Castellijn had to settle for second place, and Denise Betsema rounded out the podium with third place on the day. On the men's side of things, later on that same afternoon, it was also a very hard-fought battle all the way to the finish line. It came down to a fight between 3 riders, Ellie Isabeth, Laurens Sweeck and Toon Aerts, with constant lead changes all through the day, mainly from a very motivated Ellie Isabeth. But a technical error saw him gapped, and that left 2 riders, the Belgian national champion Sweeck and the World Cup winner Toon Aerts of Liège-Bastogne-Liege. Aerts was able to distance the Belgian champion, but with a couple of mistakes on the final lap, Sweeck got him to about 4 seconds, and it looked like they would reconnect. But it was Aerts who was just about able to go bananas, again Jeremy words not mine, through the super heavy mud straight away on the backside of the course to take the victory. That makes it 2 from 2 actually on the day for the Liège-Bastogne-Liege squad with Brandt and Aerts. Now another notable ride in the men's race came from Sven Nys' son Tabo. He rode to his career best elite result on only his 3rd race out of the juniors, coming home in 5th. He also, of course, beat some of the current stars of the sport and is still just 17 years of age. We've got more cyclocross coming up this weekend on GCN's Race Pass in the form of the first round of the Super Prestige in Gieten on October the 11th. And for many cross races, it's the true start to their seasons. That series includes 8 races with the overall decided on points. Race Pass subscribers will also get live coverage of the rest of the Ethias Cross, the DVB Trophy, and you'll also have the Cyclocross European Championships, both live and on demand. Coverage of it is available globally, except in Belgium. So head over to the GCN app now and sign up if you haven't done so already. It's going to be a cracking season. Don't forget, if you are already a Race Pass subscriber, in addition to your phone and to casting to a TV, you can also watch content available in your country on the web. Simply go to the link on the screen now and in the description below and log in with your existing username and password. Meanwhile, on the road, plenty more racing to come this week too, of course. So along with the Giro D'Italia, there is also the Brabantse Pijl men's and women's races coming up on Wednesday, and then Gent-Wevelgem on Sunday. Unfortunately, due to tighter government restrictions up in the Netherlands, the Amstel Gold races had to be cancelled on Saturday, which is a real shame. And talking about a shame, finally this week, NTT Pro Cycling revealed that the headline sponsor will be pulling out at the end of this year, leaving everybody involved in the team a little more than worried about its future. But according to Pro Cycling News over on Instagram, they could be helped by American football legend Ray Lewis. Fingers crossed the team can continue on in 2021. Otherwise, that is a hell of a lot of riders and staff who'll be scrambling around trying to find a job elsewhere. Fingers crossed. I think that team's been absolutely fantastic for the sport and of course for the Quebecer charity over the last few years. Right, that is all for this week. Don't forget you can tune into The Breakaway every evening for your post-race analysis show from the Giro D'Italia and all the other major races. I'll either see you there or on the GCN show tomorrow or on the Racing News show this time next week. Goodbye for now.